Nasser El Sonbaty arrived at the 1997 Mr. Olympia with arguably the most symmetrical and developed physique in the competition. He did not win. What followed over the next 16 years became one of the more complicated and ultimately tragic careers in professional bodybuilding. He did not come from a bodybuilding background. El Sonbaty was born on October 15, 1965 in Stuttgart, Germany, to an Egyptian father and a Yugoslav mother from Novi Pazar, Serbia. He grew up playing soccer and had little interest in competitive bodybuilding. The aesthetic of the sport, the extreme muscularity, the magazine imagery held no appeal for him. The change came through someone else's observation. A Hungarian weightlifter at his gym recognized qualities in El Sonbaty that pointed toward unusual potential, natural strength, structural size, and a body that responded exceptionally well to training. Acting on that assessment, El Sonbaty began training his upper body in earnest, rather than limiting his gym work to conditioning for soccer. Within 2 years, his physique had changed substantially. He entered a junior bodybuilding competition in Germany in 1985, placed 6th, and received a comment from the judges that he would later describe as significant. They noted he had the best abdominals in the competition. For someone who had not sought out the sport, that kind of specific recognition carried weight. During this same period, he was completing a degree at the University of Augsburg in history, political science, and sociology. His father was skeptical of bodybuilding as a pursuit and did not encourage it. El Sonbaty continued regardless. By the time he graduated, he spoke 7 languages: German, English, French, Italian, Spanish, Arabic, and Serbo-Croatian. That combination of academic background and linguistic range earned him the nickname the Professor, one that stayed with him throughout his career. On stage, his physique was among the most imposing of his era. Away from it, he carried the bearing of someone with a serious education and a broad frame of reference. He turned professional after winning at the IFBB World Championships in 1990 and debuted on the pro circuit at the IFBB Grand Prix in Helsinki, Finland. An 8th place finish earned him his pro card and gave him entry into a world most aspiring bodybuilders never reach. He began working through European Grand Prix events, placing in the top 3 with regularity and building a reputation for consistent, reliable performance. That consistency drew attention from the United States and from one man whose opinion carried significant weight in professional bodybuilding at the time, Joe Weider. The 1994 Mr. Olympia was Nasser's first appearance on the sport's largest stage. He was not expected to make a strong impression. The contest belonged to Dorian Yates, and contenders like Sean Ray and Kevin Levrone were considerably better known. Nasser finished 7th, a strong result for a debut, and his physique drew notice from those watching. Weider saw enough to offer him a contract to remain in the United States and continue competing. That decision fundamentally redirected his career. Over the following years, Nasser became a consistent presence on the IFBB circuit, competing frequently and building what would become one of the most extensive competition records in professional bodybuilding history. Across his career, he entered 53 IFBB pro shows and placed in the top 3 in approximately half of them. He appeared on more than 60 magazine covers internationally. At his off-season peak, he weighed over 300 pounds while retaining the conditioning to display full abdominal definition at that size. The combination of mass and symmetry placed him in rare company. The one title that remained out of reach was the Mr. Olympia. By 1997, conditions appeared to favor a change at the top. Dorian Yates had won the Mr. Olympia 6 consecutive times, but the physical cost of his training approach, high weight, high intensity, high risk, had become visible. He took the stage in Long Beach with muscle tears apparent in several areas of his body, conditioning below his earlier standard and the physical signs of a frame that had been pushed to its limit. The competitors were aware of it, so was the crowd. Nasser's physique that night was arguably the best of his career. He presented a combination of mass, symmetry, proportion, and conditioning that drew strong reactions from those present, including competitors who had reason to want him to lose. When the final comparisons placed Yates and Nasser side by side, the atmosphere in the arena reflected the weight of what appeared to be unfolding. Yates won, Nasser placed 2nd. The response was immediate and has continued in bodybuilding circles since. Jay Cutler, one of the most decorated Mr. Olympia champions in the sport's history, publicly stated that Nasser deserved the win. Ronnie Coleman, who would go on to win 8 consecutive Olympia titles, agreed with that assessment. Journalists and fans who covered the event described the result as unjust. Nasser was direct in his own characterization. He described the outcome as a staged result and referred to it as the biggest bodybuilding robbery of the 20th century, stating that his physique was more proportioned, more symmetrical, and free of the muscle tears that were visible on Yates, and that the judge's decision did not reflect what was presented on stage. Whatever one makes of that characterization, the result had a lasting effect on Nasser El Sonbaty. The 1997 Mr. Olympia was not simply a loss. It marked a divide between the competitor he had been before that night and the one he would be afterward. The year following 1997 should have served as a reset, a chance to regroup and return stronger. Instead, it marked the beginning of a decline that would accelerate over the next several years. In 1998, Nasser finished third at the Mr. Olympia behind Flex Wheeler and a man whose name was about to become the defining force in the sport for nearly a decade, Ronnie Coleman. Coleman's victory in 1998 was not simply another result, it was the start of a dynasty. 8 consecutive Olympia titles, an era that absorbed everyone around it. For Nasser, there was no pathway through. Ronnie Coleman in his prime was not a problem that could be solved by determination alone. There was, however, one last great moment. One final night where everything came together. The 1999 Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio. Nasser walked on stage in arguably his second best condition ever, and won decisively. The field included Kevin Levrone, one of the most formidable competitors of his generation, Jay Cutler, who would go on to win 4 Mr. Olympia titles, and Chris Cormier. Nasser beat all of them clearly and took one of the most prestigious titles in bodybuilding outside of the Olympia itself. It was a result that demonstrated what he was capable of when the conditions and the judging aligned. It would also be his last major competitive victory. From 2000 onward, his Olympia placements reflected a career in decline. 6th in 2000, 5th in 2001, 9th in 2002, 15th in 2003. He retired from competition in 2005. Somewhere during that final stretch, something else occurred that nearly ended his career far sooner. During competition preparation, Nasser developed a severe staph infection in his shoulder. The infection spread aggressively and required hospitalization for an extended period, along with multiple surgeries to save the shoulder, and by some accounts his life. When rumors began circulating that he had injected synthol into the muscle to artificially enhance its appearance and that this had caused the infection, Nasser denied it with considerable force. He maintained that his shoulders required no enhancement, that they were among his most recognized body parts, and that the accusation was an insult. Whether those rumors had any factual basis was never definitively established. They followed him nonetheless. When Nasser El Sonbaty retired from competitive bodybuilding in 2005, most people in the sport expected him to follow the path taken by most of his peers: guest posing appearances, seminars, perhaps some coaching, the gradual transition that typically follows the end of a professional athletic career. He had the intelligence and the connections to manage that transition gracefully. He chose a different direction entirely. In 2008, 3 years after retiring, Nasser sat for an extended series of interviews with David Robson of Bodybuilding.com. What followed became one of the most widely discussed interview series in the sport's recent history, not for exposing technical secrets, but for the degree to which it was unfiltered and direct. Nasser addressed a broad range of subjects. He named specific individuals. He described incidents and people with a level of detail that made the interviews difficult to dismiss as general grievance. He accused Milo Sarcev, a well-known trainer and former competitor, of owing him money for steroids and of having silicone calf implants. He spoke about the judging structure in terms that suggested systemic compromise at its core. He described Joe Weider's operation in ways that differed substantially from the image bodybuilding had long projected publicly. He discussed steroid use openly, the culture that required it, and the physical and psychological cost of competing at the highest level for more than a decade. The response within the online bodybuilding community was substantial. Forums were active with debate. Some regarded him as having said publicly what others had only discussed privately. Others, including former competitors, felt he had gone further than was warranted, that personal grievances had overtaken any legitimate point he might have been making. Sean Ray, who had competed against Nasser throughout the 1990s, indicated that Nasser had effectively distanced himself from the sport and from many former peers. Ray also acknowledged that Nasser had been a genuinely engaging presence backstage in his earlier years, a prankster, someone people were drawn to. What had changed can be traced to the 1997 Olympia. That result had never fully left him. Even a decade later, even after the Arnold Classic victory, the damage remained. He stated it directly. His trust would never be the same again, and that what had been lost was beyond repair. The 2008 interviews were not simply how he filled retirement. They were a public accounting, and they shaped how the sport would remember Nasser El Sonbaty's final chapter. What most fans didn't know, and what almost nobody outside his immediate circle was aware of until after the fact, is that while Nasser was conducting those 2008 interviews, his body was already beginning to fail in ways that couldn't be reversed by training harder or eating differently. Years of carrying over 300 pounds of muscle mass. Years of the substance use that was simply the currency of professional bodybuilding in that era. Years of extreme dieting and rehydrating, and the cardiovascular stress that accumulates silently in men who push the human body past every rational limit. All of it carried a cost, and that cost was becoming due. When in November 2012, Nasser was admitted to a hospital in San Diego, California, with difficulty breathing, The diagnosis was congestive heart failure and kidney damage. His training partner and close friend Guillermo Tom confirmed the details to Muscle Mag. From that point forward, Nasser was placed on dialysis. His kidneys were no longer functioning adequately for a man of 47. When doctors evaluated him as a candidate for a heart transplant, the procedure that might have extended his life, he did not qualify. The damage was too extensive, the risk too high. Facing those realities, Nasser chose to fly to Egypt to spend his final months with his parents and his sister. Away from the gyms, away from the cameras, away from the debates and interviews and the ongoing argument over whether he should have been handed that Sandow Trophy in 1997. He returned to the family that had watched him go from a soccer-playing kid in Stuttgart to one of the most photographed athletes in the world, and now watched him come home. He died in his sleep on March 20th, 2013. He was 47 years old. The official cause of death was a heart attack resulting from kidney failure. When the news spread through the bodybuilding community, it registered the way these things do when someone dies far too soon. Grief, shock, and a particular sadness that comes from recognizing there will be no further opportunity for the things that went unsaid. For people he had targeted in his 2008 interviews, there would be no reconciliation. For those who had followed his career and respected his intellect, there was simply the absence that follows when a voice goes permanently quiet. The narrative that formed around Nasser El Sonbaty in his later years, the embittered former contender, the combative presence on the internet, the man who couldn't move past 1997, was real, but it was not the complete picture. The full picture is considerably more complex. The sinful accusations that surrounded his final competition years were never substantiated. Nasser denied them consistently, and those who worked closely with him never corroborated the claims. What is documented is that a staph infection nearly cost him his life during that period, a serious medical emergency that required extended hospitalization and multiple surgeries. That his career continued at all following that episode is worth noting. On the subject of steroids, Nasser was direct and consistent. He acknowledged use openly, at a time when most athletes in the sport spoke about it only in guarded, deniable terms. That candor, his willingness to discuss the pharmaceutical realities of professional bodybuilding, gave his interviews a documentary value, even when the tone was confrontational. He had a degree in history and understood that what he was describing would matter to the record of his sport. He wasn't obscuring that record, he was contributing to it. There is also the dimension of his influence on the Arab and Middle Eastern bodybuilding community, a part of his legacy that receives little attention in Western discussions of his career. Nasser El Sonbaty was a visible, articulate, and highly decorated figure at a time when athletes of Egyptian or Arab descent were nearly absent from the upper levels of IFBB competition. His presence on more than 60 international magazine covers, his fluency in Arabic alongside 6 other languages, his sustained performance at the sport's most prestigious events, these carried a specific meaning for a generation of young athletes in Egypt, the Gulf states, North Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. His influence on those communities is only beginning to be fully assessed. The athlete who trained in round spectacles, who could discuss classical history between sets, who could win a Grand Prix in Europe and then compete at the same level in the United States in a different language, he was something the sport hadn't produced before, and hasn't quite produced since. Sean Ray, for all the criticism that came later, remembered the earlier version clearly. Someone who was a prankster backstage, someone people genuinely liked, someone without any bitterness before 1997 introduced it. That is what makes the full account difficult to resolve. The bitterness was not who Nasser El Sonbaty was, it was what happened to him. Go to any bodybuilding forum today, any comment section on any YouTube video about the 1997 Mr. Olympia, and you will find his name. Fans who weren't born when that contest took place have watched the footage, compared the physiques, and reached the same conclusion that competitors and journalists reached at the time, that something went wrong that night in Long Beach, and that the man who paid the highest price for it deserved better. Social media posts featuring photos of Nasser from that era consistently draw comments calling him the real 1997 Mr. Olympia. Images of him posing alongside Jay Cutler from later years generate the kind of reverence typically associated with people who actually held the title. His competition record stands as one of the most impressive in the sport's history. 53 IFBB Pro shows, top 5 finishes at the Mr. Olympia 6 times, 6 professional competition wins, over 60 magazine covers worldwide, a 1999 Arnold Classic title earned against one of the deepest fields ever assembled for that event. By any objective standard, Nasser El Sonbaty was not just a great bodybuilder, he was one of the greats. The tragedy is that the story of his career is almost always told through the lens of what he didn't win, rather than what he did. There's an argument to be made, and many people in the sport have made it, that the 1997 result didn't just cost Nasser a trophy, it cost him the psychological foundation that competitors at his level need to keep pushing forward. The drive that carried him through the amateur ranks, through the European circuit, through his 1994 Olympia debut, and the contracts and the years of relentless competition. That drive depended on a belief that the system was something you could win within. When that belief was broken, something essential shifted, and even the 1999 Arnold Classic, as dominant as that performance was, couldn't restore it. The health consequences of his career require honesty in the telling. Nasser was not uniquely reckless or uniquely irresponsible within the context of professional bodybuilding in the 1990s. The culture demanded what it demanded. Competitors who refused those demands didn't reach the level he reached. The toll his body eventually paid. The heart failure, the kidney damage, the dialysis, the death at 47 was not separate from the sport. It was a direct result of what that sport required. That truth, uncomfortable as it is part of his story. What remains after everything, after the controversy and the bitterness and the health decline and the early death, is something that endures in the way that real legacies endure, through the people who were changed by what he did. The young athletes in Egypt and Serbia and Germany who looked at Nasser El Sonbaty and decided that the stage was a place they could stand. The fans who watched the 1997 footage and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the judging of human achievement is never as objective as the people doing the judging would have you believe. The bodybuilders who came after, who approached the sport's political structures with clearer eyes because of how openly Nasser described what he had seen. He called himself the uncrowned Mr. Olympia. He called himself the Wizard of Truth. Whatever one makes of those titles, one thing is difficult to argue with. He told you exactly who he was. He never pretended the sport was something it wasn't. He never softened the edges of his experience to make it more comfortable for the people who ran the organizations that had, in his view, failed him. For a man who had trained his entire career to look a certain way for judges, he was notably uninterested in performing for anyone when the cameras were recording his words rather than his physique. An clean trick bid Volktans. He died in Egypt with his family, in his sleep. 47 years old. One of the most extraordinary physical specimens the sport had ever produced, and one of its most intellectually engaged ambassadors, gone before most people understood that the conversation with him was nearly over. The Sandow Trophy from 1997 sits in someone else's collection. The debate over who it should have belonged to remains unresolved, and the man at the center of that debate, the scholar, the mass monster, the outspoken critic, the family man who returned to Egypt when there was nothing left to fight for, deserves to be understood fully, not only through the single night that defines how most people think about him. The whole story is larger than one result, and so was he.